Today, I'd like to go through an activity that I really like to run with large groups, and it's a particular approach to brainstorming or team building in large organizations. I'm thinking groups of 30, 40, 50, maybe 100 or 150 at one time. And I've done this for a number of years now in different settings and have found it to be quite successful. And I think it's pretty simple to do. And this is going to be a presentation which goes through step by step the approach that I've used and have found some success with. What you'll find, though, is that none of it is particularly original. This is all based off of how might we prompts, and how might we prompts come out of a lot of the human-centered design work. And there's an infinite number of posts online discussing this. You can look on YouTube or in blogs or in IDEO's own design kit, which is linked on the website on the blog. And IDEO really has been, for the most part, leading this particular area. The one difference, perhaps, with this presentation is it's a particular approach on how to do this activity in a very large group. And essentially what happens, if we were to just summarize it in maybe 1 minute, is you bring a large group of people together, and then you split them off into smaller groups of 4 to 6 people. A prompt is put up on the screen in front of the room, which is phrased as a how might we prompt, such as how might we make reporting easy. And then people come up with ideas related to the prompt, write each idea down on a sheet of paper, and then announce their idea after they've written it down to the group. And this goes around in circles as people come up with more ideas for around 7 minutes, and then that round ends. And in a particular session, which might last about an hour, you might go through perhaps somewhere between 5 to 7 of these types of prompts. Now, I've found this particular activity to be really good for 2 things. And the first is being able to generate a lot of ideas very quickly. You'll walk away from this type of an activity with probably hundreds and even over 1,000 different unique ideas which have been generated. So from trying to get a broad understanding of different ways you can approach a particular problem, it's very good. The second benefit is that I found it has really good impact on team dynamics. If you have people who either don't know each other and you're needing an icebreaker activity, or if you have just an organization that you want to bring together to work better together, bringing everyone in a room, allowing them to essentially talk for 60 minutes with each other, and to talk about the future and talk about solving problems, and to allow everyone to feel heard, everyone to contribute, really does good things for the team. And I feel that that's the second benefit of this activity, which is perhaps understated. Now, what I would like to do is go through 2 parts here. The first is going to be discussing the work you want to do while preparing for this type of a project. And then the second will be to actually discuss how to run the session the day of it. So the very first thing you may want to consider is the need for a how might we session. And as I mentioned, this tool is good for being able to both generate lots of ideas to try to solve a particular problem, which would be phrased in this how might we prompt, or it might be good to promote teamwork, do strategic planning, operational goal setting, or company or brand identity, of which I found this is a really good tool for all of those above. And once you've found a need to do this type of activity, and for the most part, you can do this activity for pretty much anything you can think of, then you might want to go on to actually generate your list of how might we questions. Now, when approaching how to generate these questions, there is a whole set of things you can consider, and that's a bit outside the scope of this presentation. I link in the blog post to several different articles on how to write how might we questions, and if you do a Google search, you'll easily come up with many different posts. The thing, though, that I would advise is that there is an approach in human-centered design where the first step involves trying to understand the problem and trying to gain insight into what the problems are, and then going from that step to developing how might we questions, which might try to look at trying to solve different problems which you've identified, and then moving to the third part, which is actually answering the how might we questions. I found in general it is difficult to do all three parts: the analysis of the situation, the generation of the questions, and the answering of the questions in one single session. And in particular, it's quite difficult to have a large group try to craft sets of how might we questions together. And so therefore, I would recommend that if you're running this session either in a large group, or if the intention is to run one hour or hour and a half session in total, to draft the how might we questions ahead of time. And so that would be my strong recommendation. And it's generally works well. The second is when you're drafting the how might we questions, that you're going to want to have a mix of statement types, meaning some of them will probably be abstract, some will be rather concrete, and I would suggest that you pick your most concrete and obvious how might we question. So, how might we make reporting easy is a very tangible, concrete problem statement for the group which we ran this with last month at OpenMRS. And so that's why that was the very first question we started with. That allows people to get the hang of things, understand how it works, and put your more abstract and aspirational statements later on in the case mix. Once you've generated a potential list of statement types, you'll want to test these prompts. And one of the ways to test them is to either go to one person, or ideally, if you're going to be doing this with a really big group, actually assemble a small group of 4 people ahead of time, get them together, explain what you're going to be doing, how the activity will run, and that you want their feedback, and show them each prompt statement. And after showing the statement, look at everyone and their reactions. A good prompt statement will, you'll see people be interested as they read the statement, and then usually the small group of 4 people will start talking with each other right away. And you'll probably have to tell them, you don't go through the whole activity right now. We're just showing you the prompts. And that's a good sign if people are engaged immediately after reading the statement. A bad prompt question is that when you show the question to your test group, they look confused. They're physically on their faces. They're trying to figure out what it is that you mean. The question might be ambiguous, and there's too many ways to interpret it. And there's a long pause before anyone speaks. So that's a question which needs to be rewritten. And then the third is that you display the prompt question to your test group, and there's really no reaction. People aren't upset, people aren't happy. It's pretty bland or average. And I think an average prompt also needs to be rewritten, because the prompt needs to engage the audience and they need to want to solve it. And it's quite easy to rewrite the prompt statements. In fact, you'll have a small test group in front of you. Just ask them how the statement could be fixed to make it better. And usually it just involves tweaking a few words here or there to dramatically change the impact of the prompt statement on the group. What you'll also want to do when you're speaking with that small group before the session is you'll want to maybe do one demo round with them, showing them exactly how this activity will run, and then ask them when you run the full session if they would, one, volunteer to be part of a live demo in front of the audience or in front of the whole group, and 2, if when you split up the large group into smaller groups, if they would each go and find their own group to help, rather than forming a group themselves. And so in this way, you essentially find people in your organization who have done this activity before, and you use them to be sort of quiet leaders which distribute themselves anonymously throughout the groups in the room and help those groups stay on track and understand how the activity works. And very lastly, you'll have to think about how you want to set up the room ahead of this activity. Most people who run this activity, from what I can see on the internet, use Post-it notes and sticky notes, and so they need wall space. Personally, I actually much prefer using regular small sheets of paper. And so in that case, you need table space. And if you're going to go with paper, you're going to need to have tables around the room so that people can gather around 4 to 6 around 3 sides of a table. All right, so now why don't we move on to actually running the How Might We session on the day of this session? Well, what I would recommend is there's going to be 10 steps, and you can put these 10 steps up on the board as you talk through them with the group. And you're going to start the session by introducing it, explaining why the activity is being done, what you hope to achieve from it, and how people will have a really good time doing the activity. The very first step is that people need to stand up. And of course, if anyone's ever tried to do this with a group or an audience before, it's always difficult to get people to actually stand up and go along with it. But generally, you'll be able to get, probably 3/4 of the room to stand up at the beginning, and that's okay. Just explain that a lot of the magic of this activity, of the energy which is created in this brainstorming session, only works if people are standing. And from my own experience, it just doesn't work when people sit. A lot of the dynamic energy in the room of this brainstorming session falls away the moment a few people start to sit down. So you need to stand up. Just from my own experience, it works much, much better. And then once people are standing, ask that they assemble themselves into groups of 4 to 6 people. No less than 4, no more than 6. And that they gather their group around a table and they introduce themselves. Now, depending on your organization, the way that you ask the groups of 4 to 6 to assemble will be different. If you're doing this more as an icebreaker activity, you'll ask that people find groups of 4 to 6 people that they don't know, which is, of course, why they're introducing themselves. If you're doing this in an organization where people already know each other, you might ask that people gather in groups of 4 to 6 where everyone is from a different department. Because what you're really trying to do in the group formation is have representation from as many diverse backgrounds and skill sets as possible. Because it's that diversity in thought and background which contributes to the ability to come up with very different ideas. And that's kind of one of the big benefits of this session. Now, why is the number 4 to 6? Well, the reason for this, from my experience, is that if you're in a group of 3 or less, there's not enough people in the group to keep the momentum going, meaning that someone will have an idea which they've written down on paper, they'll say it and announce it to the group as they contribute that idea and put it on the table, but there'll be pauses and silence as you go around and different people speak, because people need to think and they need to write their ideas down. And the problem with, if you have a group of, let's say, 7 or more, that is that people will have had ideas and be ready to speak them out loud and contribute, but they'll have to be waiting to speak because someone else might be speaking, and then that, again, also takes some of the energy out of the group. And so I find that 4 to 6 typically is an optimal number where people are able to almost continuously have someone in the group discussing what their idea is, putting it down, and then there not being too much of a gap between the next person having an idea that they want to contribute. Now, when the groups self-assemble into groups of 4 to 6, inevitably people are going to be in groups of 3, and you're going to have some groups of 10. You'll actually have to go and really encourage people to get into 4 to 6. And so the group of 10, take it apart and break it. Groups of 3, add a few people to their group. And I would actually encourage the groups to probably be 4 to 5 at the beginning of the session if you know that a lot of people will be trickling into the session late, because that way they can join the groups of 5 and form groups of 6 without these groups going over size. But yeah, the group size is really important, I find. Just same with the standing up. So now what you'll have is people around the table, and some will have already started to sit down. And so that's why I put up, step 3 as stay standing around the table. Generally, by this part of the activity, people get it. They know that they're going to be standing for the next hour. There's not really much pushback or problems from here on in. They kind of get the idea that this is just the way that this session is going to work, and it's not going to be, some sort of a boring lecture where everyone sits down. So you won't need to worry about that here on in. Next step is that you should distribute paper among the groups and ask them to rip the paper into rectangles around the size of a credit card, and that everyone needs a pen. And the reason for this is that's what they're going to write each idea down, is on those small sheets of paper. Now, some organizers might want to do this themselves ahead of time, but to be quite honest, it's kind of a waste of your time because the group can do it for you. And I actually like giving the people something to do, because now as people are ripping paper, you'll be able to complete the instructions, and the instructions will be a little bit less boring because people will be actively engaged doing something else. How many sheets of paper should they, or how many small cards should they create? Well, you'll probably actually need, if you're going to do, let's say, 4 to 6 rounds, or 5 to 7 total rounds. And if in each round someone comes up with 10 ideas and you have a group of 60, you can kind of do the math that you'll actually need quite a number of these small sheets of paper. So now what you do is, as the people are tearing paper in their small groups, you tell them that you're going to go through how the session will run. A prompt will be put up on the projector in the front of the room, and it'll always start with "how might we," such as "how might we make reporting easier?" Whatever your demo sentences that you put up, make it relevant to the organization. Then what will happen is that people will start to come up with ideas related to that prompt, and what they should do is write that idea down on a piece of paper. And they should put one idea on each sheet of paper, and they can capture that idea however they want, using words, images, sentences, pictures, whatever captures the essence of their idea in a way that makes sense to other people and is legible to other people. Because don't forget, ultimately someone's going to come around and collect these cards and type them into a computer and compile them. So they need to capture the idea in a way which people can legibly interpret it after the session. Now, of course, you might have to remind the group at this time that they shouldn't actually be going through the activity with the demo prompt. This is just an example. What happens afterwards is, once you've written down one idea on one sheet of paper, you say it out loud to your small group in front of you, and you put that sheet of paper onto the table in front of the group. And when you put the idea down on the table, it's important that you don't stack them all up on top of each other, but place the sheets of paper, distribute them across the table so that the whole group can read all the ideas together. And as you place these ideas on the table, you might naturally group some of them together that just make sense. Don't spend too much time grouping them together, but it'll be kind of obvious which prompts you want to, which responses go close together, and it'll make sense to group them that way. As you go around the session, you're going to be building on each other's contributions. Some people may say the same thing that someone else said, and that's very normal. That's just a good part of this activity. And then finally, at the end, you collect the papers at the end of each of these rounds. If you're doing this with a number of groups of 4 to 6, you probably don't have enough table space to use a different table for every prompt. And so therefore, you're going to need to clean the table at the end of each prompt, have the sheets of paper stacked up and placed at the end of the table, and then have someone come around and collect the responses after every prompt so that they can be entered in the computer afterwards. If you're doing this activity with a small group and you have a lot of table space, rather than cleaning up after every prompt, you could just move down the table and use the empty table for each prompt. But it depends on your needs. The very last thing, right before you go into the activity, is going over the rules for brainstorming. Now, this list is being generated by IDEO, and you can, of course, see the original list linked from the blog post, which is part of a very good package they put together for the Acumen Human-Centered Design Workshop. But essentially, the key objective of the activity is that we want quantity of ideas. And we don't want to evaluate the ideas, judge the ideas, or discuss the ideas. And so therefore, the rules for brainstorming are: 1, defer judgment or praise; 2, go for quantity; 3, encourage wild ideas; 4, build on ideas of others; 5, stay focused on the topic. 6, one conversation at a time. And 7, be visual. And so this is really the only parameters for this brainstorming session. But the big thing is people shouldn't be engaging in discussion or criticizing the other ideas. The real goal is just to keep building on each other's ideas and coming up with more. It would be similar to an improv where the answer is always supposed to be yes and, or some people use the analogy to jazz music where each subsequent musician builds upon the melodies of the previous one. And so then what I would encourage you to do is to call up to the front of the room a few people who you had already spoken with earlier and ask them to be part of a 1-minute demo. So for the 1-minute demo, put up a demo prompt on the board, have the 4 to 6 people at the front of the room who will be demoing it read the prompt, and then they should go around with actual pens and papers and generate ideas. Write one idea per piece of paper, announce the idea. Once they've finished writing it, put that idea on the table in front of them, not stacking the ideas up, but laying the ideas out so that everyone working around the table can see the ideas. The demo will take under 1 minute. Hopefully there's no more questions at this time, and then you go right into the full session. And the session pretty much always works. And so that's how you run a giant how might we brainstorming session. What I'd like to do is just answer a few common questions that sometimes come up with regards to running this type of an activity. The very first one is, how long should each prompt be? Meaning, how many minutes should be spent on each prompt? And I don't actually have the perfect answer for this. It depends on a few factors. In general, you could probably budget around 7 minutes per prompt for the brainstorming part of this session. And the issue, though, is what your goal of running this activity is. If you're running this activity with a number of new people, novices, or a key component to the activity is the team dynamics, creating excitement in the room about solving a particular set of problems. And in this case, the length of time which you actually run each prompt depends on the room's dynamic. Meaning that if the room seems to be continuously generating new ideas, people are still engaged and talking, even when you get to the 7-minute mark, extend it, a few more minutes until it looks like the energy in the room is quieting out. So you might end up going 9 minutes for one prompt. On the other hand, if, by the 5-minute mark, people are beginning to look around, they're looking bored, they're no longer talking as much, then it's time to move on and just call the prompt early. In general, no one else is actually timing the prompts, and so you can just say, there's 30 seconds left, pretty much whenever you want, and then call it from there. And that's kind of the approach that I've used. That is different, though, if you're running a How Might We session with either with a more experienced group, or where actually trying to solve that particular problem during the session is a very high priority. In those cases, you may actually want to set the timer for the longer end, for 7 to 10 minutes. And in this case, you'll probably end up having a certain amount of awkward silence as the higher minutes unfold. But in this case, it's okay because the group is more experienced. They know that there'll be awkward silence when it gets to that part of the session. And the group that you're working with is small enough and of a high enough expertise that people are really engaged. They're deeply thinking about the problem, and a lot of really good insights come in those awkward last 3 minutes. But in general, those last 3 minutes, which are awkward, don't work well in a really big group, and they don't work well with a group of novices, or where the team dynamics and the energy in the room is much more important than the final answer which is arrived at. And so you need to read the type of a session you're running and base your session length on that. How many prompts should there be? Well, the optimal length for one session is probably 45 minutes to 60 minutes at most. And so you'll probably get maybe between 5 to 7 prompts in that period of time. When we did this session a month ago in Nairobi, it lasted, I believe it was around 70 minutes in total, and that's because we went through the instructions and we went through 6 prompts. And I think that would be about the upper limit of time to spend on this before wanting to move on. What should you do with late arrivals or really large groups? What you'll find is that depending on the setting you run this type of an event, more people will come and join the other groups. And sometimes the groups then will form to become 7 to 10, even though it started at 5 people at the beginning of the session. If by prompt 3 a group is now 10 people, go in and encourage them to split into 2 separate groups. Similar, if a new arrival of 5 people join the room after prompt 1, just encourage that whole group of 5 new people to become their own group, and find someone who has done this activity well from another group and bring that person over to teach this new group how to run the activity and coordinate it with them. Some common mistakes which you often have to address is groups may try to stack the pieces of paper on top of each other on the table when you really want to encourage them to lay them out in front so people can see all the responses throughout the activity. The second is that people may not speak during the activity and silently write ideas on sheets of paper with the intention to share all the ideas at the end of the session. Again, you want the idea sharing to happen in real time. Another issue is that sometimes people will be having detailed conversations about the prompts or trying to criticize good ideas or bad ideas. Again, make sure that the rules for brainstorming aren't broken and that we just focus more on trying to generate ideas rather than evaluate the ideas, because that's really the next step entirely. And then, a common mistake might be that some people sit down, but you probably won't run into that problem if you make this clear at the start of the activity. One last question is, does this always work? Well, I actually think it does. And I've done this, I'm definitely not an expert in this activity in any way. There's a number of people who do this far more than me. But having done this over probably about 6 years in different venues and different settings, I found it to be pretty successful. And you can measure success in 2 different ways. The first is that you're bringing together a group of people and they're going to speak to each other for 60 minutes. And they're going to talk about the problems they've had, they're going to talk about current issues, and they're going to probably talk about the future. And they're going to leave the session felt heard, felt energized to have worked with their colleagues, feeling optimistic about solving the new problem at hand. And this is a tremendous success for any organization or any group. So if you're doing this for strategic planning or operational planning or team building or team dynamics or kicking off a new problem or trying to tackle something which is being a big issue for your organization, you have achieved success simply through doing this activity and the impact that this can have on your team and operations. You may not solve all the problems in 1 hour in your organization, but at least you've created the capacity in the dynamics of your organization to be able to go forward and solve them better. People usually feel really good after this activity. And so I think that's why it's always a tremendous success from that perspective. If you look at this from the other perspective of what about the actual content generated, does that always, quote, work? Well, I think it does if you're looking at this from the perspective of trying to generate a wide differential of many options and many different ways to answer the prompt questions which have been presented. And so you will certainly have far more different ideas than you ever would have had if you just had a small group of people sit around a boardroom table to generate a list of potential responses. And so that's why you can use this type of activity for anything from aspirational future prompts to very concrete prompts, such as trying to develop product names or character identities or branding. You can make this a very concrete problem and you're trying to generate a list of names for, or a very aspirational or more abstract problem. It works for both. And then after this activity, you'll also have a really good understanding of what's front of mind for people. Certain themes will come out which have been repeated by many people through many groups in this activity. And you'll know, this is clearly something that's front of mind in the organization. Now, whether it's the right answer is a different story, but at least you have taken a pulse and poll indirectly of your group. One of the questions sometimes which comes up is, will you come up with the killer idea or the really new, profoundly transformational insight during this activity? And I think it depends. It certainly doesn't always happen, but sometimes the activity lays the groundwork, as I said, to allow the team to be able to come up with that insight in the future. And sometimes you do come up with really great insights and transformational ideas through this activity. The times when that happens, you really need a special dynamic. You need people with very different skill sets and very different backgrounds to be all in one small group together. And so it's that diversity of thought and idea and experience and bringing it together, which creates a lot of the magic. The second is the people in this group need to be very quick on their feet. They need to be great at generating ideas. They probably should all be out-of-the-box thinkers by default. And it would be good if they knew each other and worked well with each other. And if you put all those elements together into one of these sessions, you can come up with a lot of great ideas. Anything else? Just as closing thoughts, one thing to consider is the sequence which you lay the prompts out. Sometimes the prompts will be entirely different from each other and not actually have a logical sequence, which is perfectly fine. Sometimes, though, you can order the prompts in a particular sequence where you tell a story. Perhaps you're starting with a problem more historically, moving to a problem more concurrently, and then looking more to the future. And so you have kind of a narrative structure from that perspective if you look at the session overall. One of the things, though, to watch for is if your prompts are too similar, people will start to use the same answers they had in the prior prompt when answering the subsequent prompts. And then they'll feel that they're just giving the same answers each prompt, and that makes the session less interesting. And so make sure that the prompts are certainly different enough from each other, and that's sometimes something I've had trouble doing. One last comment, though, is what do you do after the session? Well, you're going to want to, as I've said, after each individual round, go around and collect those sheets of paper and separate them so you know which prompt corresponds to which group of papers. And then you'll probably either want to have someone type these prompts verbatim into the computer, and then you can sort them afterwards however you like, or B, you may want to have someone go through and come up with the major themes from the session and then share that with the group afterwards. Or you may lay out these prompts again, on a really large table and try to compile them. One thing which I would just like to share with you here is when the session was run with OpenMRS, as I said last month, what we did afterwards was we took all the individual discrete responses, and if you're watching this on the YouTube, you'll see what we're looking at, and we generated 1,551 different ideas in that session. So they were all typed into a computer, and then we took out the major overall themes from the entire session and put that into one compiled document. Then, going through each individual prompt, we created just a few sentence description summarizing what the response to that prompt was. We also went and created a easy-to-view word cloud about the prompt, a more detailed word cloud, and then actually shared with people a copy of the raw data where we had taken approximately the 300 unique responses from each how might we prompt, grouped those responses into groups of somewhere between about 3 and 20 different items which were approximately similar together, and then put each of those small groups into a bigger category and shared this with people as well. And we took those large categories, which you can see here on the screen, building reporting community, standardizing reports, making it easy to use modules, and wrote about those in text as well. And so there's a number of ways which you can take the output from this activity. Sometimes the output is actually just the insight from one particular single ticket, which happens to be the really great insight that you want to pursue, or it might be a short list of 5 potential different branding images that you want to experiment with in the next session. So there's really not a right or a wrong way on how to take the output from this session. It really depends on your needs. One last question. Why don't I use Post-it notes? A few comments. Because most people who run this, from what I've seen, put Post-it notes up on the wall. One, I think Post-it sticky notes are way overpriced. And so that's one crucial reason. The second is that they're really a pain to work with if you have a large group. Because at the end of the session, you want to collect the sticky notes and then to have them typed into the computer. And because the sticky notes are sticky, they just get tangled into a mess. Whereas if you have small sheets of paper, which are all roughly the same size, it's very easy to stack those up. It's very easy to transport them. And it's easy when you're trying to type them into the computer to flip through the small sheets of paper. The other advantage is I actually like the dynamics of using the table rather than using the wall. When you use the table, you'll have participants standing around 3 sides of the table. That way they can all see the cards in front of them. You don't want someone standing on that 4th side because everything will be upside down to the way that they read it. Whereas if you have a wall, you sometimes need a separate surface for people to write on, and then you need people to go to the wall. You also are able to get people standing in a semicircle, looking at each other, talking more directly face to face when you use the table. And I like that dynamic. Whereas again, with the wall, it's a little bit less face to face because you're all trying to front yourselves against the wall that you're posting these tickets on. And I actually think that people's eyeballs are closer on average to the tickets on the table because you can get closer together as a group rather than looking at the wall. And because your eyes are closer to the tickets, it makes it a little bit easier to actually read what people have written. And from a practical perspective, there's often not enough wall space if you're doing this with a large number of groups in a single room, whereas typically most rooms have tables in them, and so you'll actually have more usable space. Well, there you go. That's, I think for the most part, everything I know about this. This is really, not based on any science. It's just from anecdotal experience, having done this a few times. And I would encourage you to give this a try in your own organization. It's pretty low risk. I think it has very high potential for reward. It seems to work for the most part in any type of organization I've tried it. And I hope that you realize that there's 2 big reasons you may want to use this. One is the impact on team dynamics, either as icebreaker activities, launches and kickoffs of solving new problems or new products, bringing people in your organization to work together better. And then the second is to actually solve a particular problem and to generate large differentials on ways which that problem can be approached, and trying to hope that some really great ideas will come out of the brainstorming session. If you have a different way of running this session, I suspect you're probably have done this far more times than I have. I would love to hear from you, and best of success in your ventures with this. Let me know if you actually run this session and how it goes. I'd be curious to find out.